Today, we'll be talking about an issue that epitomizes the power of the presidency: presidential pardons. Are these godlike acts of forgiveness a benevolent gift to our nation, or do they represent yet another opportunity for our government to fail the American people? Now, the power to pardon is enshrined in Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. It allows the president to grant reprieves and pardons for federal offenses, except in cases of impeachment. This authority was established to temper justice with mercy, to correct judicial errors, and to offer a second chance to individuals deemed worthy of clemency. But, of course, history shows us that the pardon process is often mired in controversy, fraught with allegations of favoritism, political payback, and outright corruption. Between 1900 and 2023, U.S. presidents granted 14,485 pardons and some 6,428 commutations. Some presidents were more generous than others. Franklin D. Roosevelt, for instance, issued 3,687 pardons during his 12 years in office, while President George W. Bush issued just 200 during his 2 terms. But remember, it's not about the volume of pardons that draws scrutiny. It's who receives them and why. Data shows that wealth and connections significantly increase the likelihood of receiving a presidential pardon. According to a 2020 study by the Brennan Center for Justice, applicants with legal representation or ties to influential individuals are disproportionately favored, leaving ordinary citizens, many of whom may equally be deserving, out in the cold. This disparity underscores a broader critique that the pardon process often perpetuates systemic inequities rather than addressing them. But before we start bashing the system of presidential pardons, let's not lose sight of the potential good that they can achieve. Pardons have been used to address historical injustices, such as when Barack Obama commuted the sentences of over 1,700 individuals serving harsh sentences for nonviolent drug offenses under outdated laws. The day after his inauguration, President Jimmy Carter granted a blank pardon to Vietnam War draft evaders, an act that was highly controversial at the time, but meant that hundreds of thousands of Americans would avoid prosecution, and those who had fled the United States could safely return to their home country. Pardons have also offered a path to redemption for figures like George Wilson, who was pardoned in 1830 after being sentenced to death for robbing a mail carrier. Though, in an ironic twist, Wilson refused a pardon and was ultimately executed. A president's pardoning power also includes acts of clemency that fall short of a full pardon but reduce the consequences of a criminal conviction. For instance, President Obama commuted the 35-year sentence of military whistleblower Chelsea Manning and released her from prison after 7 years of incarceration. The idea of presidential pardon starts to get dicey when we see the potential for abuse of power. Unlike most federal actions, pardons do not require congressional approval or judicial oversight. Now, while the Department of the Justice's Office of the Pardon Attorney is tasked with reviewing clemency applications, presidents are under no obligation to follow its recommendations. This lack of checks and balances has turned the pardon process into largely a political tool, wielded at the sole discretion of the president. Arguably, the most infamous pardon in modern history was President Gerald Ford's decision to pardon Nixon after the Watergate scandal in 1974. President Ford defended the move as a way to heal the nation, but it effectively ended his political career. Public outrage was so palpable, in fact, polls from the time show that nearly 70% of Americans opposed the pardon, seeing it as a get-out-of-jail-free card for corruption at the highest level. Now, consider Bill Clinton's final hours in office, when he issued 140 pardons, including one for financier Mark Rich, who had fled the country to avoid prosecution on charges of tax evasion and illegal trading with Iran during the hostage crisis. Rich's ex-wife had donated heavily to the Clinton Library, raising serious questions about pay-to-play politics. And then, of course, there's Donald Trump, who arguably used the pardon power more brazenly than any president before him. Trump's list of pardons include allies like Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, and Steve Bannon, all individuals convicted or accused of crimes directly tied to his administration. Perhaps the most controversial was the pardon of former Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who had been convicted of criminal contempt for defying a court order to stop racially profiling Latinos. Critics called it a flagrant abuse of power designed to reward loyalty and defy the judiciary. Now, let's take a look at our current president, Joe Biden, and how he has used his power of pardon. If we overlook how Biden's infamous 1994 crime bill contributed to America's mass incarceration crisis, his actions have been largely empathetic, inspiring, and long overdue. Here is a statement directly from the White House that summarizes some of the broadest acts of clemency to be granted by an American president. And I quote, "The president has used categorical clemency more than any of his predecessors, which has allowed him to widely and systemically respond to historic injustices. His bold and unprecedented categorical actions, broadly outlined below, include the following. In October 2022, the president issued a full, complete, and unconditional categorical pardon for the offense of simple possession of marijuana. Back in December 2023, the president issued another proclamation that expanded earlier relief for the offense of simple possession of marijuana, attempted simple possession of marijuana, or use of marijuana, regardless of whether the individual had been charged with or prosecuted for the offense on or before the date of the proclamation. In June 2024, the president issued a full, complete, and unconditional categorical pardons to certain former military service persons convicted of offenses based on their sexual orientation, specifically unaggravated offenses based on consensual private conduct with persons age 18 and older occurring between May 31st, 1951 and December 26, 2013, as well as attempts, conspiracies, or solicitations of such conduct. The president's categorical approach to clemency has also inspired leaders across the country to take similar action. Over 10 states and localities, including Maryland and Massachusetts, have issued categorical clemency for marijuana convictions, impacting hundreds of thousands of people and allowing individuals to move past their convictions and move on with their daily lives. And that ends a statement from the White House. In addition to these larger actions, Biden has continued in Obama's footsteps by issuing scattered pardons to individuals convicted of nonviolent drug offenses. He has also commuted the sentences of many people, again, mostly those with drug-related convictions, who have been serving time in home confinement under the COVID-era CARES Act. Then, December 12th of this month, President Biden announced that he is granting clemency to nearly 1,500 Americans, the most ever in a single day, who have shown successful rehabilitation and a strong commitment to making their community safer. The president is commuting the sentences of close to 1,500 individuals who were placed in home confinement during the COVID-19 pandemic and who have successfully reintegrated into their families and communities. He is also pardoning 39 individuals who were convicted of nonviolent crimes. These actions represent the largest single-day grant of clemency in modern history. We can argue that this act of seeming generosity is a case of too little too late, coming from a president with a long history of deepening racial disparities with inequitable drug crime legislation. But we'll take whatever we can get. Now, on the less altruistic side of Biden's pardoning powers, have there been abuses? Well, certainly. The most obvious case, of course, would be Joe Biden's controversial pardoning of his son, Hunter Biden, making him only the third president after Clinton and Trump to pardon a relative. Biden, of course, at first vowed that he would not pardon Hunter, but went back on his word after deciding that his son was being unfairly targeted. Joe Biden announced, quote, "I believe in the justice system. But as I have wrestled with this, I also believe raw politics has infected this process, and it led to a miscarriage of justice. I hope Americans will understand why a father and a president would come to this decision," end quote. Now, was Hunter Biden treated differently than others who have committed the same crimes? Well, yes. Either way, his pardon does set a troubling precedent for an office that has already proven itself to be above the law, and President Biden has been heavily criticized for this action. In addition, the second most common recipient of commuted sentences by President Biden, aside from people charged with drug offenses, are foreign nationals who were used as bartering chips in prisoner swaps. This type of clemency has been granted to a handful of Russians, including Viktor Bout, 5 Iranians in September of 2023, and 3 Chinese citizens back in November of 2024. I will readily admit that I do not know how common it is for a president to use clemency for this purpose, but a quick Google search describes the action as politically risky. It would take much more investigation to determine if Biden arranged these prisoner swaps for the good of the nation for humanitarian purposes, or for the self-serving reason of exchanging favors for political leverage. President Biden still has thousands of clemency petitions waiting on his desk, and nearly a month left to make a massive difference in the lives of the people who have submitted them. So let's see what he may or may not do before January 20th, 2025. All in all, we can conclude that the power to pardon is a double-edged sword. It embodies the best and worst of American governance, capable of both delivering justice and subverting it. As citizens, it's our job to hold our leaders accountable, to demand this power is exercised with integrity, and to ensure that it serves the public good, not personal or political interests. So as we reflect on the history and controversies of presidential pardons, let's ask ourselves, what does mercy look like in a democracy? And how do we ensure that it is extended equitably and not reserved for the wealthy, the connected, and the loyal? What can we do to reform the flaws in this system? And that is the last word up front. I'm Sean Sainhart, and this is Coup Save America. Today, we welcome a very special guest with a mission to help us understand more about the pardoning power of presidents. Shannon Lynch is a producer, host, and audio engineer with 9 years of experience in audio journalism. And Shannon has a very good reason to be interested in presidential pardons. And you'll find out what that is right after the break. Shannon Lynch holds a master's degree in audio technology from American University. She also attended Georgetown University as an undergraduate, where she double majored in political science and music. And she is an alumna of the Georgetown Government Honors Program. Shannon's journey in audio began in 2016 at Sirius XM, where she honed her skills producing daily political news shows like The Morning Briefing and The Press Pool. Her career took a leap in 2019 when she joined the think tank New America as a podcast producer, where she created shows that delved into political news and criminal justice reform. The Marshall Project, Fox 5 DC, WTOP, The Washingtonian, and DCW 50 have featured Shannon's work. She's here with us today to speak about a time-sensitive project, her podcast series, The Alley, DC's 8th and H case, which tells the story of 8 young Black men who were wrongfully convicted and given life sentences for a murder committed in 1984. The Alley DC's 8th and H case was a finalist in the International Women's Podcast Awards and the Publisher Podcast Awards. Washington City Paper named The Alley the best local podcast of 2024. And Shannon joins us right now. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you so much for having me, Sean.
Thank you so much for joining us. So I listened to your podcast, and first off, great job, and it was very fascinating.
Thank you.
It was very angering at the same time.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I'm wondering if you can give us just a concise summary of the events surrounding Catherine Fuller's murder back in 1984.
Absolutely. So on October 1st, 1984, Catherine Fuller, who was a 49-year-old woman, was murdered in an alley near the intersections of 8th and H Streets Northeast in DC, hence the name, the 8th and H case. And she had been brutally beaten and sodomized with an object that was never recovered. Her body was discovered in the alley by a street vendor who noticed that as the police arrived, that a young man was fleeing the scene with an object concealed under his coat. Later that evening, the police got an anonymous tip that claimed that a group of kids that hung out near that intersection were responsible for the crime. And basically what ended up happening, we see often in police investigations like this, is the detectives really formed this level of tunnel vision and didn't really pursue any other theories outside of this quote unquote gang theory. They ended up arresting 17 young Black Washingtonians, which is actually the record in U.S. history for the most arrests for a single murder that wasn't part of a conspiracy. Um, Very similar to the Central Park Five case, which many of us are familiar with. There were multiple coerced false confessions that were later recanted under oath. Um, and right before the trial was set to begin, the prosecutor came across these eyewitness statements about the young man that was seen fleeing the scene right after the body was discovered. And rather than pausing the trial process, the prosecutor and his team hid this information from the defense lawyers. And so, with nothing else to go on besides these false confessions, there were 8 young men that were given life sentences. And now, 6 of those 8 men are alive, and those 6 men are currently seeking a pardon from President Biden.
When I listened to your podcast, the idea of this gang rape theory sounded so utterly absurd to me. And it got more absurd as it went on. This chaining of events where, one person led to another person. It just seems so utterly absurd to me to think that this is how this crime progressed.
Mm-hmm.
How did police arrive at this initial theory about this gang rape?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the anonymous tip came in the night, early morning hours of the next day, so October 2nd, 1984. And with such a heinous crime, the detectives were under a lot of pressure. And as you can imagine, efficiency wise, it makes more sense for them to focus in on a specific single theory and basically try and find evidence that supports that theory, which is a little bit backwards. The goal should always be to seek truth and seek justice.
Right.
But the reality is that detectives and prosecutors often are more pushed towards convictions and results rather than seeking truth and justice. And that's what happened.
Did it just, I still just, even given what you've just said, this idea, especially given the circumstances of the case. Now, the garage where this occurred, where the woman's body was found, Catherine Fuller, was a very small garage, and it would be virtually impossible for this large group of people to be engaged in this crime in this alley. Is that a fair assumption?
Absolutely. And part of that, I mean, there are multiple reasons pointing to that. Part of it being that Mrs. Fuller's injuries were not consistent with a large group of people assaulting and raping her. The other part of that being this was on the busiest intersection in this part of the city. And it was also the first day of the month, which is when most folks cash their checks, whether they be paychecks or government assistance checks. And it also happened to be that there were 2 banks on this intersection at 8th and H. So the prospect of a group of 20 plus teenagers attacking a woman and dragging her down an alley or carrying her down an alley and raping her, and there being no independent eyewitnesses to such an act, just it really boggles the mind that there's so and unfortunately you see that again and again in this case. There are so many instances of reasoning that just aren't logical on the part of the prosecutor and the government's case.
And there was, I'm going to call it evidence to suggest that another person probably committed this crime. Can you speak to that a bit?
Right. So, as I mentioned really briefly in the beginning, a street vendor discovered Mrs. Fuller's body in the alley in the garage a couple of hours after the time of death, or shortly after the time of death. And they called the police, and they noticed as the first police officer, the responding officer, started to drive into the alley, that there was a young man that basically sprinted out of the alley. This is a pretty big alley with multiple corridors, so it was very easy for him to go in a completely different direction than what the police were coming in. And the young man that found the body found that very odd, and so gave this signed statement to the police that evening. In fact, the responding officer also recorded a statement on it. So there were multiple statements about this young man fleeing the scene with an object concealed under his coat. And mind you, the object that was used to sodomize Mrs. Fuller was never recovered. So putting two and two together, you might guess or assume that perhaps what he was hiding under his coat is what he used to sodomize her. And then also, on top of that, this young man that was seen fleeing from the scene was also convicted of other very vicious attacks against women in the same neighborhood in the same month that Mrs. Fuller was killed. And after he was released from prison for these other assaults, he ended up committing an almost identical murder in an alley just a few blocks away from where Mrs. Fuller was killed. So there's a lot pointing to this man as the actual perpetrator, but because he didn't fit into this gang theory, he was really ignored and excluded. He was a loner. He didn't really hang out with a bunch of the other kids in the neighborhood. So to group him in with the kids that hung out at the park near 8th and H would not have fit into the police and the detectives' theory that this was done by a gang.
And what role did community pressures or societal factors occurring in the DC area at that time play into shaping the investigation? I mean, was there a lot of gang activity going on in this neighborhood, or was that just sort of something that came out of nowhere?
So there was actually little to no non-existent gang activity in DC at the time. So we're looking at 1984. This is just before the crack epidemic hit, which of course ravaged DC in a very terrible way. But at this time in 1984, there was really no gang activity. But what we did see was heavy coverage of gang activity in places like LA, that were broadcast, nationwide. So there was absolutely this level of unease in other cities where there might not have actually been gang activity yet. And I think that had a huge factor to play in the police seeing this as a plausible explanation. You see it a lot more enough, and you're conditioned to believe that this gang activity is a huge issue. And detectives are humans too. They get exposed to the same type of media that the rest of us do. So no, there wasn't gang activity. What there was, however, is um, and if the detectives had been from that neighborhood and understood the culture a little bit better, they would have realized this, that there are, and back then even more so, events called go-go's that often young people would go and listen to music. It's kind of like a subgenre of funk. And at the go-go's, different neighborhoods are grouped together. So an MC will say, like, is 8th and H in the house? And everyone from that neighborhood, will make noise and so on for the other neighborhoods. So there was an association of them. However, that doesn't mean they were a gang. They were a group of kids that went to concerts together.
What reasons do you think that the police have sort of had to pursue this incorrect theory about the crime? Do you think that there was hint of racism? Do you think that there was, because there was one cop that you mentioned in the podcast, I can't remember his name, who came in much later, who was known for kind of harassing kids in that neighborhood. So what reasons do you think the police might have had to sort of pursue this theory despite evidence pointing otherwise?
I think that racism was a huge factor here. I do not think that if this were a group of 15 to 20 young white kids, that this would have even gone to trial. Again, because the case against them was so thin and just purely based on these false confessions. So I don't see this happening to a group of young white kids. And like I said, detectives are human like the rest of us. And are perhaps predisposed to believing that maybe a group of Black kids could have done this. Maybe, they can kind of justify it in their mind, that they think it makes sense. But that, and justifying that in your mind and convincing yourself of that, is just to completely ignore the hard evidence, the physical evidence in this case.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. I want to talk about the false confessions a little bit. How were they obtained?
This is very fascinating. And like I said, probably the most well known instance of this is in the Central Park Five, aka the Exonerated Five. And what most Americans don't realize is that police officers are 100% not only allowed to, but encouraged often to lie to people they are interrogating, because it can be used as a strategy to get someone to confess. And these lies might look something like, um, you know, they might walk into the interrogation room with a folder full of blank papers and say, I have all of this information, all of these statements from your peers about you being at this crime scene, or I have test results that show your DNA was at the crime scene, or that I have, your fingerprints. So you might as well just confess so I can help you get some leniency in this situation. And you add on the factor of someone being a kid. You add on the factor of someone not having a lawyer present or not being fully aware of their rights. And you compound that by 10, 15, 20 hours in an interrogation room. Um, and you can see how someone may just say something to get themselves out of this torturous situation that they truly believe they're going to be convicted for anyways, because that's what the police officer said, I have this evidence against you. So it's a very interesting psychological phenomenon, but is absolutely plausible. And especially in this case, you see that the first false confession that was coerced was out of a young man named Cliff Yarbrough. And at the time, he was 16 years old. He was alone in this interrogation room for over 10 hours. And he also had a learning disability. So he was incredibly vulnerable. And the police knew that and took full advantage of that to get a quote unquote confession from him.
And there was also a case of police brutality leading to a false confession as well. Is this the same individual that you just mentioned?
It is, yes, it is. Cliff, recounts, and he talks about this in the podcast, being also physically abused by detectives during this interrogation.
And he was even taken to the hospital at one point.
He was. He was taken to the hospital for an injury to his leg, but it was explained away as an injury he had from playing basketball. But that was an injury he sustained at the police station during interrogation.
And in fact, he initially told the nurse that he was assaulted by the police. And then when the police came back into the room, he recanted that statement as well.
Yeah, because he was threatened. Those detectives threatened him before they went to the hospitals, saying, you better not tell anyone about this or we'll do much worse, or something to that effect. They were threatening. And again, you're a 16-year-old kid by yourself with a learning disability. What are you going to do in that situation when these two powerful detectives are physically threatening you, but also threatening your freedom? How would you react to that?
Now, false confessions, and we saw this, and you mentioned this on the podcast too, and and Netflix documentary "Making a Murderer," where I believe his name is Brendan. Also, I think a 16-year-old who was coerced into confessing. How do these confessions kind of work? Because one would assume, well, if I'm not guilty of something, I would never, admit to a crime. But the tactics go way beyond just lying, don't they? I mean, and these threats, they actually, what's the word I'm looking for? They they share certain facts, because the whole idea is that, only certain facts will only be known by people who committed the crime.
Mm-hmm.
So during the questioning, investigators kind of fed details about the crime to the people that they were interrogating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. So often what you'll find is there will be maybe some key general factors that may be correct in false confession, but then some of the smaller details kind of fall to the wayside and are completely incorrect. So, for example, in the 8th and H case, there was one of the false confessions talked about the object that was used to sodomize Mrs. Fuller. And, at some point during that very long interrogation, what will happen is, the police will say to the person they're interrogating, how how did she sustain those internal injuries? The person being interrogated might say, oh, well, she was kicked in the stomach. And the detectives might say, well, are you sure? The person, responds, yeah. The detectives respond, is it possible maybe that she was assaulted with an object internally? And, then the person being interrogated kind of plays along and they end up either they're really being fed these details. So that's what happened in this instance. However, the size of the object, as shown by the physical evidence, did not correlate to what the false confession ended up saying. So in this example, he got it right that she was sodomized and that caused internal injury, but was completely off on the size and the type of the object. So that's a really good example of that. And then in one of the other false confessions, you see, that the young man, the teenager, explains that a group of teenagers, carried her down the alley during this attack. And it gets the point across that it was a group of teenagers committing this crime, but it's completely factually wrong because of the injuries that we saw in Mrs. Fuller's body that showed she was dragged a long distance, not carried. So those are just a couple of examples of these very common inconsistencies that you see in false confessions.
And this phenomena of police lying to suspects is unique to the United States, is it not?
Yes, it is relatively unique to the United States. There are other places in the world where it happens. However, in most developed democracies, most developed countries, police officers are not allowed to lie to the people that they're interrogating about whether they have evidence on this person or not. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, police detectives are not allowed to lie to you if they have you in an interrogation room by saying, I have your fingerprints at this crime scene. They can't do that. And as a consequence of that, they get much, much, much fewer false confessions than we do. And, so we see when the goal is to get a confession and not necessarily the truth, sometimes you're going to get a confession that isn't the truth because you're using these very aggressive, threatening tactics.
And there have been numerous studies conducted where individuals are invited to take part in the study. These are not even police interrogations, and they've been coerced into giving a false confession to a fictional crime that they did not commit. And this is exceedingly common for people to fall into. So I think for listeners who are thinking, well, that would never happen to me, I would always maintain my innocence, I would never confess. I think that's a false assumption to make. I think that we're all susceptible to these kind of pressures because it's a form of psychological torture in a sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And another piece of it that I should have mentioned is, we are, as humans, we are conditioned to trust authority. So even, if someone is telling us something that we logically in our heads think, well, that's not true. I wasn't at that crime scene. There's no way you could have had my fingerprints. it's coming from a police officer who we are conditioned to believe as a point of authority, then, your mind can be even further tricked into, after, again, hours and hours and hours of these interrogation tactics. Well, maybe, is it possible that I was there and maybe I was drunk or something and didn't remember it? Or, could I have just blacked it out from my mind? Is it possible that I actually was there? And you see how this can happen, can truly happen to many people. And I will say, not just minors and not just people with learning disabilities. We've definitely seen this happen in adults as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's just absurd to think that we have a criminal justice system that allows this kind of thing to occur.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when, again, the focus should be on finding the truth and finding the actual perpetrators behind a crime. There was also evidence. Well, back to the interrogation real quickly. These were not videotaped throughout, were they?
That's right. And, it's funny how little policing techniques have changed in the past 40 years. Um, in most jurisdictions in the United States, there is no video whatsoever of the interrogation. And in the few jurisdictions where there are, they record what is basically called a summary statement. So what you will see on that recording is after 10, 15 hours of interrogation, then the police will turn on the recorder and, go through this, again, false confession on tape that they have rehearsed several times before they even start recording with the person that they're interrogating. And that's what you see. That's all that you see. Now, there are, very few places where they will record from start to finish the interrogation. But in my opinion, I don't see the harm in doing that. I mean, I think we should probably be doing that everywhere, because even a detective that might not be trying to get a false confession from someone, right? If they're encouraged to use these tactics, at one point or another, it is going to lead to a false confession. And how could they, fully learn from that and retrace their steps and see, oh, this is why I, really suggested this information to this individual, if it's not videotaped? So, yeah, the answer is there's very minimal video.
Yeah. Do you think that a full video would have done anything to exonerate these men?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Without a doubt. I, again, these statements were recanted under oath later on, these false confessions. And each of these individuals later on gave very similar accounts of what happened, and that they went in and, for the first hour or two, saying, no, 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 I know nothing about this. I wasn't there. I don't know anyone that was there. And then the police, you know, become threatening, whether that be physically, or in one instance, an individual was threatened that his mother, they would go after his mother for credit card fraud. And then, they might lean into it just a little bit. Well, I didn't take part in it, but I saw it from a distance. And then once that door is open, police really dig in and keep pushing and pushing and pushing until they get something from you that they deem substantial enough. And it's the same pattern you see from all of the false confessions in this case.
And this was getting so absurd with so many people that other kids in the neighborhood were fearing that they would be next, correct?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. So they actually brought in, I believe it was over 300 kids from this neighborhood, which is an incredible number if you think about it. And it's honestly a wonder that there weren't more kids that falsely confessed to this crime. And so, out of those 300 plus kids, you get just a few that give these false confessions after being threatened relentlessly by detectives. And part of it being as well that at this time, I don't believe that the DC police still do this, but at the time, if you, for this crime, if you said that you had some information and you, each time you would come into the police station to share information, the, the police would give you, I think it was $20 each time that you went in. So in a working class, lower middle class neighborhood, and you're being encouraged to share information, but $20 isn't an insignificant amount of money, especially in 1984 and 85. So you can see why there were, even more beyond these kids that were brought in, adults that were also, brought in, or adults that brought in kids to give information and were incentivized by this money that they would get each time they come in.
Yeah. What can you talk about the evidence that was withheld by the prosecutor and how it would have likely changed or could have changed the outcome of the trial?
Mm-hmm. Well, there were several pieces of evidence that were withheld by the prosecutor, but the most important being that these multiple eyewitness statements that said that there was a young man fleeing the crime scene right after the body was discovered, just as police arrived at the scene, was completely hidden. None of the defense attorneys knew that this had happened. And at the time, like I mentioned very briefly earlier, the prosecutor didn't come across this information until I think it was 1 or 2 months before the trial was set to start. So by this time, they had been building a case against these kids for a year. And, ethically, what he should have done is paused and said, well, is everything that I've collected so far, it's counter to this information I have about this very likely alternative perpetrator of this, one individual that very likely could have committed this crime. But rather, he justified to himself, well, he couldn't have been part of the gang, so he couldn't have been the perpetrator. Kind of that very roundabout confirmation bias. Um, and so he just, he individually decided, I don't need to share this information because it's not relevant. And so that's what he did, and he got away with it. Prosecutors do this all the time. They can very easily hide information from defense lawyers and get away with it.
Now, that's referred to as a Brady violation, which is against the law, theoretically, at least, as we find out later in this case. This got appealed all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States on this very notion that a Brady violation occurred and that this information, had it been revealed to defense attorneys, could have changed the outcome of the trial. What did the Supreme Court decide?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So yes, I'm just going to back up a little bit more for context. The Brady rule is actually something that came out of a Supreme Court decision in the mid 20th century, which says that prosecutors are not allowed to withhold information from defense lawyers that may change the outcome of the trial. And so, again, another piece of this that a lot of Americans don't realize, a prosecutor is privy to and has access to all of the information, all of the files, all of the notes that detectives and police take throughout their investigation. By default, and a prosecutor has access to all of that. Then what happens from there is the prosecutor and his or her team essentially get to decide what of those files, how much of that information is shared with the defense lawyers, the people defending the accused, the people being accused of the crime. And so, it brings the obvious conflict of interest. Well, if there was something that could help this defense lawyer beat this prosecutor in this trial, wouldn't the prosecutor do their best to make sure that the defense lawyer doesn't get that information? And that's exactly what happens. And, again, it is against the law. Prosecutors are supposed to share information that could change the outcome of a trial. However, the accountability of that, the way that that's checked is very murky, because often it's either, that prosecutor themselves making that call again, which is that prosecutor wants to win that case.
Right.
They're not going to be incentivized to share that information that might help their opponent. And if it's not being overlooked, just just themselves looking over it, it will be someone on their team. It will be someone on the prosecutor's team, someone in their office, maybe their boss, that is looking over this information, that also is very often incentivized to make sure this prosecutor wins, especially when you look in, places where like a DA, a district attorney, is elected. They want wins. And so, as you can see, this ends up, it's very, very common. The prosecutors get away with hiding this evidence. And then if at all, if they do get caught, there's very little repercussions. It's kind of most of the time, vast majority of the time, maybe a slap on the wrist.
And in this case, the prosecutor admitted in court that he had withheld evidence, and still nothing happened.
Yes. So, yeah, to answer the second part of your last question. So yes, I believe it was in 2015, that after their new legal team, the falsely accused men's legal team, brought to court this evidence of this very likely alternative perpetrator. In court, under oath, this prosecutor admits, yes, I did hide this information from the defense lawyers, but I did it because I didn't think it would change the outcome of the trial. And again, that's very subjective. That was what he was thinking at the time, hoping to win this case. But it's really, how logically most people would look at that and say, well, if the jury was aware that there was a very logical explanation for an alternative perpetrator, that would probably change their perspective a little bit on, who might have committed the crime, you would think.
Yeah.
However, our legal system, and definitely our Supreme Court, has not caught up to this notion, this idea of how real and common false confessions are. So the Supreme Court looked at the information of this, incredibly important information that was withheld from the defense lawyers, and also looking at the false confessions. And the Supreme Court wrongly, I believe, decided that these false confessions in the eyes of the jury would have outweighed these eyewitness statements that claimed, or that showed, that there was a alternative perpetrator at the scene of the crime, who also had this history of violence towards women, who also committed an almost identical murder. That's what they decided.
Yeah, that was the most infuriating part, I think, of listening to your podcast, was that decision. I understand the police targeting on this theory, I suppose. I mean, this tunnel vision, this racism, these insidious. But the prosecutor, you would think, why would he choose to suppress evidence rather than just reevaluate the case? Was it just about winning? Do you think he wanted to win the case, or do you think he actually believed this case?
I do, to his credit, I do want to give the prosecutor the benefit of the doubt. And I do think that by this point, he truly believed that these were the perpetrators, and he thought in his mind, in his own reasoning, he was doing the right thing. And I know that sounds odd, but I think he probably believed he was doing the right thing by not sharing this information, because it would jeopardize his ability to put these kids away, who he really, truly believed committed this crime. That's giving him the benefit of the doubt. If, it's also very possible that he found out this information and thought, oh no, these kids really might not have done this, but I've already done, a year of work on this. And if I were to pause it now, and we would have to admit that we were wrong on our theory, that would make everyone involved look very bad. The prosecutors, as well as the detectives and the police department. So that it's very possible that that was with ill intent. But we can never really know for sure.
Were there any defense attorneys who suspected prosecutorial misconduct at the time of the original trial?
Um, there was some pushback, not a ton, but there was some pushback on from the defense lawyers. I will say, and it's important to note this in the context. So there were 11 individuals that were on trial, and they all had either a public defender or a court-appointed lawyer. So the DC Public Defender's Office is actually incredibly sufficient. They're, well known as probably the best public defender's office in the country. The problem is, in a case like this with many defendants, you can only have one person having a public defender because, in any case, you can't have, if there's multiple defendants, they can't have lawyers from the same firm representing them in case of a conflict of interest. So the majority of these attorneys were court appointed, and really not up for the task. I'll put it that way. Several of them had never defended a homicide case before, or had records of misconduct otherwise. And so it really, without the resources and the competency of a good lawyer, it wasn't really likely that any of these defense attorneys, other defense attorneys, were going to be, pushing and doing extra ground legwork on figuring out if the, prosecutor was hiding any type of evidence. And it's like, you don't know what to look for if you don't know what to look for,
Right.
So
what role do you think systemic racism played in jury process?
in the jury process? Well, it is important to note that the whole jury was Black. However, I mean, that's not to say that people might have, conditioned notions of what, certain groups of people are capable of versus other groups of people. But even the jurors, several of them were interviewed after the fact. Several of them said, we had a really hard time coming to this conclusion. A lot of it logically didn't make sense to us with the conflicts of the details and the different confessions, but they weren't presented with any other alternative theories because none of the defense lawyers knew that there was a very likely alternative theory. So they kind of, out of necessity, after a while, just kind of were beaten down and decided, I guess we'll vote that they're guilty. Although several of them, expressed after the fact that they were not confident in that decision at all.
And there were two suspects that were not found guilty, correct?
Mm-hmm. 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 Yes, there were two. One of those two was the person being represented by the lawyer from the DC Public Defender's Office, which I said they're very, very capable, so it's not a surprise there. The other one was the only young woman that was being tried, and she was, found not guilty. And the others had very terrible, to be honest with you, terrible, insufficient representation for their lawyers, and they were found guilty.
Yeah, this is just a travesty of justice all the way around, in my opinion. So can you walk us through the process of obtaining a presidential pardon?
It's actually simultaneously quite involved, but also quite opaque. So there's several different ways that a person can receive a pardon from a president. The most formal way that you can go about it is you would submit a pardon application to the Justice Department, There is an office of the pardon attorney. There's a person at the Justice Department whose sole job is to look at pardon requests and make a recommendation to the president whether someone that's applied for a pardon should be given one or not. But that individual, they submit this application form that is incredibly involved. It goes beyond just, why you think you should be pardoned, but also what you've done with your life, since the conviction happened, or your community work and statements that from other people that attest to your character. So just to give you an idea, each of these 6 men who applied for presidential pardons, each application is around 400 pages long.
Oh, wow.
So, right, huge, documents that basically, have all of the facts of the case, but also just about anything you would ever want to know about these men personally are in those applications. So as you can imagine, it takes a long time for these applications to be reviewed. And the Office of the Pardon Attorney will go through these applications in detail, and they will go through multiple rounds of reviews. And then after these rounds of reviews, the pardon attorney, she makes a recommendation to the president on whether to pardon or not. Now, with that being said, the president can do whatever they want.
Right.
Even if the pardon attorney says to the president, you know what, I don't think you should pardon this person, it's completely in the hands of the president. He or she has the sole discretion to decide that. And also, it's important to note that even if someone hasn't submitted a pardon application to the the Department of Justice, a president can still pardon anyone at any time and not have to really give any explanation. That's just a kind of blanket power that you explained in your introduction that presidents have. And unfortunately, it's become a tool to either benefit people that are wealthy or very well connected, but also I think should be used as a tool to address some of the very, very clear injustices that happen in our criminal justice system.
Yeah, absolutely. While researching this episode, I was interested in obtaining a list of people who have been granted a presidential pardon after a wrongful conviction, and I couldn't come up with any particular case. Do you know of any cases that are similar to the H&H case where wrongfully convicted individuals have been pardoned?
On the federal level, no. This would be exceedingly rare. In most federal pardons, it's an instance of someone has admitted guilt to a crime, and this pardon is viewed as an act of mercy for that person admitting their guilt. But there are instances of it on the state level. So that's another important piece of this puzzle, is that in all 50 states, so for example, I'm in Washington State right now.
Oh, okay. So are we, by the way.
Oh, you are? I didn't know that. I live in DC, but I'm currently in Washington State right now. So if I were a citizen, a taxpayer, a resident of Washington State, and I committed a crime here, I could go to the governor of Washington State and ask for a pardon from them. And there have been instances across the United States of someone being wrongfully convicted of a crime and then being pardoned by a governor. However, that's incredibly rare at the federal level. And because DC is not a state, they don't have a governor to go to. They have to go to the president. That is the only option. So again, it's kind of another really, in my mind, injustice in this instance, that these men are, have been treated very differently by the criminal justice system than anyone would have in any of the 50 states because DC is not a state.
Yeah. So why do these men believe that pardon is the best route for justice? In reality, it's their only route for justice, correct?
At this point in time, yes, it's really the only option left. Um, and, people have asked me this time and time again. All of these men were released from prison after serving their minimum sentences, which is not, should not be minimized. None of these men at any point admitted guilt, and they could have. They could have gotten out of prison decades ago if they had said, actually, yes, I was involved, I was there, and I'm sorry for that. But they weren't willing to lie to get out of a difficult situation. Their character, their integrity meant so much to them that they weren't willing to lie to get out of prison. So collectively, the 6 men that have applied for a presidential pardon, they spent more than 200 years in prison. The shortest sentence was 26 years, the longest, 37 years. And the last of them to be released, Russell Overton, was just released in 2022. So they, are out now, but they're still convicted felony murderers. And as you can imagine, the status affects every part of their life. Um, you know, People often, the first thing people think about is their jobs and their job status, and it excludes them from, even being able to apply to a lot of jobs or being considered for a lot of jobs. Even if they are able to apply to it, they often face, pretty harsh discrimination by hiring managers who see this on their record. And because of that, the jobs that they can obtain, are fairly like low paying jobs. They are all, you know, really, really hustling, working very hard to just make ends meet. Several of them have taken 2 jobs at a time. Um, they work jobs that are physical, and these men are in their 50s and 60s. Um, and so the job situation is a big part of it. Another part of it, just on a personal level, is several of them have become quite isolated because they don't trust, understandably so, they don't trust a lot of people. And, so that makes it hard for them to form, romantic relationships or friendships. But also, in the instances where they have tried to make those connections multiple times, it's happened that they start to explain this wrongful conviction to a new person they meet, and that person just, doesn't want to hear it.
Yeah.
I mean, those are 2 examples. And another one being, you know, they will never be able to get back the decades of their lives that were stolen from them. They never will be able to. But it means so much to them that people, especially in their own city, in DC, have this very clear stamp of approval on the fact that they did not commit this crime. It, would be huge in their mental healing. They were subjected to so much incredibly fierce trauma
In prison.
in prison. Yes. And, it would go a very long way to have the president of the United States say, yes, what was done was wrong to you, or what was done to you was wrong. And, we can't give you back the time, but maybe we can clear your name.
How likely do you think this pardon is to be approved?
It's very hard to say. So, like I kind of hinted at earlier, the process after you submit the pardon application it's pretty dark as far as the visibility from the public. We don't know if their applications have already been rejected, or if they're on a 3rd or 4th round of review, or if they possibly could be granted in like the last days of President Biden's presidency. We really, really don't know. However, we can look at some of the context clues here. And, Biden has already demonstrated his willingness to, kind of go out on a limb and grant a lot of pardons and commutations. You mentioned in your introduction that the single most, highest number of clemency granted in a day in U.S. history was President Biden a couple of weeks ago. Was that a week and a half ago? And then just last night, um, President Biden commuted the 37 people on death row, meaning that they would still be in prison, but they were no longer at risk of being executed. So that is a huge deal. That is a big statement. And so I think even though it is very, very, very rare that a president would grant a pardon to someone that was wrongfully convicted, I think if anyone's going to do it, you know, as the context that we see now, it would be Biden that would do it. So I think that's a positive sign.
Yeah, I agree. Do you the Innocence Project is also involved in this case, are they not?
Yes. So the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project has been working on this case for 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah. And, they were there throughout the whole process of appealing it all the way to the Supreme Court, claiming that this information about the alternative perpetrator would have made a difference in the outcome, and have continued to be part of it, assembling a team of lawyers that, helped these men write their pardon applications and that continue to represent them. Um, and, all of this, of course, has been pro bono work on the part of both the Innocence Project, the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, but also the lawyers that they've recruited from various high-powered firms in the District of Columbia.
I want to ask you, what drew you to this case initially?
I was actually living in the neighborhood where Mrs. Fuller was murdered when I found out about it. Um, man, 5 years ago now, maybe. And, I almost every day past that intersection had walked down that alley multiple times and had no idea that this crime took place there. And so I just started reading into it, and, it became very apparent that a grave injustice happened here. So at that point, I was already working in podcasting. I was producing podcasts for other people, and I was doing it full time. Um, but I had never hosted a podcast myself. And so, I started researching it, and it took me about 2 years before coming out with the first episode of The Alley. But it really just all spurred from, um, the living so close and feeling like more people really needed to hear this story. And overwhelmingly, when I've had conversations with people, it's becoming more and more known for sure, but people feel the same. They say, I can't believe I didn't know about this. This is appalling. And so it just kind of validates, I think, that I felt at the beginning that I really needed to share this with as many people as possible.
How has your work on The Alley impacted your perspective on the criminal justice system?
Ooh. Very significantly. Um, I, for most of my growing up years, I wanted, after going to Georgetown for undergrad and studying government, I wanted to go straight to law school. I thought I wanted to be a lawyer for most of my life, and always had this very strong interest in law. And as a matter of fact, my father was a federal prosecutor. Um, so I was very interested in this, but after looking into this case, there are certain things like, for example, the ability of police officers to lie to you and get away with it in interrogations. I wasn't aware of that. And coming from someone that was already very interested in law, that was shocking to me. And it's really, humbling to realize that there are so many aspects of our criminal justice system that are truly unfair.
Yeah.
That it's almost like the more you know about the criminal justice system, the more you realize, that it is very plausible that there are a lot of people in prison right now that did not commit the crime that they're in there for. So it's just, been a huge factor in how I think our criminal justice system is run.
Were there moments during your research that shocked or deeply affected you that really stand out?
There are many. The most impactful would be during my conversations with these men that were falsely accused of this crime. Something that truly struck me and continues to is every single one of them could absolutely, at this point in time, just be so angry with the world that, they don't want to talk about what happened to them. They want to lock themselves in a room and, never interact with anyone. But it's incredible to me that none of them have done that. These men, they are, all doing community service and helping their communities, not because they have to, but because they want to. And, are very pleasant people to be around, very kind, genuinely kind people. And that just blows my mind because I don't think personally, I don't know if I would have the capacity to still practice and display that level of grace and really love, for others and for my community after that same community did that to me. That's really been truly the biggest personal takeaway that I've had during my research and producing this podcast.
What was the most difficult aspect of producing this podcast?
Well, I did all of it myself. So I did all of the recording and interviewing, all of the research. I wrote all of the scripts. I voiced all of the scripts. I edited everything, mixed it, So just in the fact of, doing most of it myself was really tough. But if I had to pick one like specific element of it, well, there's really two. um, the level of writing was a challenge for me. For each of these episodes, at least the first eight that initially came out, scripts were, anywhere between like 15 and 25 pages each episode of narration that I wrote. And I'm not a writer. I was an audio engineer, I was an audio producer. And so that was definitely a challenge. The other very challenging part of it for me is, again, I was an audio engineer and producer. I had never hosted or voiced a podcast. And so, it definitely brought a new appreciation for the hosts that I do work with that are so good at what they do. Because it is hard. It is very hard to host, whether it be an interview podcast or a narrative work like The Alley. And so I just, realized that it's a real skill set that you can't just wing it with.
Yeah. How have listeners responded to The Alley?
every level of feedback that I've gotten from people has been, um, you know, at some level outrage that this happened.
Yeah. Right
Um,
here too. Outrage.
yes. Um, but also um, just being thankful that they were made aware of the case, and for a lot of most people that listen to this podcast, this was the first time they had heard about this case and this story. And it's definitely it's upsetting. It's upsetting to hear these stories. It really is, especially for something that happened in your own community in your own city. Um, that you feel like the wool was pulled over your eyes and you never knew about. But it's also incredibly important to tell these stories because if we don't, then nothing will ever be done about them or things will not change to prevent similar stories from occurring in the future. So for the most part, people have, been expressed, just gratitude that they were able to learn about the story through the podcast.
I believe we actually have a clip of the podcast. Would you mind if you played that?
No, not at all.
If my producer can cue that up for me. It's the Alley, DC's 8th NH case.
I spent 35 years incarcerated for something I didn't do. I spent 36 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit.
I was incarcerated for a crime I didn't commit for 37 and a half years.
I spent 36 years incarcerated for a crime that I didn't commit.
I was falsely accused. I served 35 years in prison for no reason at all.
I spent 26 years in maximum security prisons for a crime that I did not commit.
This is The Alley, DC's 8th NH case.
And I want to just let my listeners know this is available on all major podcast platforms. The Alley, DC's 8th NH case. You can also go to newamerica.com, .org. Sorry about that. newamerica.org and find it. And I am talking to Shannon Lynch, the producer of The Alley, DC's 8th NH case. I know that you've got limited time here, so I want to kind of close this out with a call to action. What steps can our listeners take to advocate for justice in this case?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, pointing to what you said at the beginning of this episode, pardons are more likely to happen for people that have influence. And while these men may not have influence in the classical sense of the term, in the sense of that they're very wealthy, connected individuals, they do have a level of influence and can continue to have even more influence through public awareness and pressure. So it's very important, first and foremost, to educate yourself on this case, but also share it with other people, make other people aware of it, and in that way you can post on social media about it. Social media, we've seen over the past 10 years has been an incredibly important tool in people getting pardoned. So, we ask that if you do post about it on social media to use the hashtag 8thNH Justice, and that's the number 8 THANDHJUSTICE. And if you want to take it a step further, you can go to the website that's been set up to support these men, and it's also the same name, 8thNHjustice.org. And there you will find a link to sign a letter of support. But you'll also find all of the records from their pardon applications that you can read through yourself. I think a big message that the legal team that represent these men have tried to make here in making all of this, readily available online is that they have nothing to hide. There's nothing to hide in these men's plea for a pardon. And so they really just want the world to just look at the facts, and they're confident that if people just look at the facts, they'll realize that a very clear injustice happened here.
If you could speak directly to President Biden, what would you say about this case?
So many things. I mean, I think the most direct message I would want him to take away is, you know, just look at the facts in this case. Look at the facts with an open heart and mind. Um, and, I truly, wholeheartedly believe that if he just takes the time to review it, he will also realize, President Biden is a very intelligent man. I believe that he will view those facts and come to a conclusion that, you know, these men did not commit this crime and they don't deserve to live the rest of their lives with this conviction hanging over their head for something that they did not do.
Yeah. Yeah. The website is 8andhjustice.org. That's 8th and hjustice.org, where you can sign that petition. Shannon, I want to thank you so much for joining the podcast and sharing the story with my audience. And I wish you the best of luck in this case. I think, and in your career too, you're clearly very talented as a podcast producer, and I would say host as well. I really enjoy listening to the podcast. I think there's a few episodes left that I haven't listened to yet. I got all the way up through the, I think the 8th episode.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking forward to finishing that. Is the podcast finished, or are you going to continue with it?
Well, first of all, I appreciate you saying that. That means so much to me. Sharing that with me. But yes, it is still going. In fact, so the first 8 episodes were published in 2023, and then this year, after the pardon applications were submitted, we started making episodes again. So there right now are 4 more episodes. Another one is coming out on Wednesday. And so there are 2 episodes that kind of explain where things are with the pardon applications being submitted, and how these men are feeling at this stage in the process. But then there's also going to be individual episodes with each of the falsely accused men that are just one-on-one interviews. And the purpose of those, we're not even discussing the case, because by this point, if you listen to the podcast, you know everything there is to know about the facts in the case. These one-on-one interviews are really just to get to know these people, on these men on an individual level. I thought it was important that the listener is able to learn more about them as people and as individuals in the same way that I've been able to learn about them over the past 3.5 years. And so in these conversations, I asked them things like, what did you want to be when you grew up? Or, who was your hero as a child? Things like that, that really, of course, when we hear these stories and we read about them, people are often appalled, but I don't think that people often connect or, are fully aware or present in the fact that these are people, these are human beings, just like you and I. They have aspirations and hopes, and had wonderful childhoods, and I think it's important to communicate that to the listener, to humanize these men. I think is really important.
Well, again, thank you so much for joining me today. Had a wonderful conversation. And again, please listen to the podcast. If we can put the cover up again. The Alley, DC's 8th NH case, available wherever you get your podcasts. And I believe that there's a website that we have. There we go. newamerica.org/the-alley. That's newamerica.org/the-alley, where you can go directly and view the website for the podcast. Shannon, again, thank you so much, and have that merriest of holidays and a happy new year.
Thank you so much for having me, Sean.
No problem. And we will see the rest of you next year. This has been Coup Save America.
Stay tuned to hear about the lifelong effects of false incarceration, straight from the mouths of the 6 men now seeking presidential pardons. This is The Alley, Episode 10.
On November 20th, 2024, my colleague Ben Sands and I walked to the White House, which is just a block from the New America office. The sounds of drilling and pounding wood filled Lafayette Square. Construction had begun on the viewing stands for the presidential inauguration parade, set to occur in exactly 2 months. We went to the White House to ask a simple question to Americans visiting the home of the president. What does a presidential pardon do?
It frees somebody from prison.
During my conversations about the 8th and H case, the vast majority of people I talk to believe a presidential pardon is only good for one thing.
From what I'm understanding is it frees people that are wrongfully incarcerated.
When I tell people that the falsely accused men applied for a presidential pardon, they almost always respond with the same question.
Well, why do they need a pardon if they've already been released from prison?
Even though Levi Rouse, Chris Turner, Charles Turner, Cliff Yarbrough, Timothy Catlett, and Russell Overton were released on parole after completing their minimum sentences, nearly every aspect of their lives are affected by the murder conviction that continues to hang over their heads. For starters, when they first got out, the prospect of just beginning their adult lives in their 50s and 60s was daunting. Here's Timothy Catlett.
I tell a lot of people, I say, man, I'm like a 21, 22-year-old kid getting out here trying to find a way in life. You know, when I look at other people my age, you know, they got houses and cars and, you know, and here I am, I got out at 55 and I'm saying, man, where I'm going to start at, how I'm going to start.
After facing the massive challenge of reorienting themselves in a society that bears little resemblance to the world they left in 1984, the men from the 8th and H case were subjected to many other obstacles. For example, their ability to form relationships and friendships after prison have been strongly affected by their continued status as convicted murderers. Charles Turner says he's hesitant to share the conviction with people he meets.
You know, we go out in the world, we meet people. Some people we become all right with, some people we don't. But for me, it's just always a part of me that I know I'm not going to share with people.
Due to their understandable mistrust of others, several of them live pretty isolated lives. Here's Russell Overton.
I basically just be home with my family. I don't go out nowhere. You know, I just stay home and live off of one check at a time.
Levi Rouse also avoids being around strangers.
By me being incarcerated for so long, I don't trust people. I don't like being around people.
Chris Turner relayed a story about a woman he was dating at one point.
One young lady I was dating, she had heard her brother told her that that's one of them guys off that killed that lady in the alley. And she didn't want to hear no more. She didn't want to hear my side of the story.
These men's relationships with family members have also been strained. In some instances, the conviction severed familial relationships that couldn't be fixed, even after their release. Levi Rouse told me,
my family, you know, some of them I don't even speak to no more because I feel that nobody was there for me when I went in prison. I feel like if you wasn't there for me when I went in, you're not there for me now.
Chris Turner fathered 2 sons prior to being sent to prison. Despite his best intentions, decades of separation have made it difficult for him to rekindle these relationships.
The way my relationship is affected with my sons is we don't really know each other. My ideas of them being my sons was different than their ideas of me being their dad. I had ideas that I wanted to do and wanted to share that I never got a chance to do with them. How do you begin being a dad to someone that's in their 40s and you haven't been a dad to them over the course of their life?
Additionally, the conviction makes finding stable housing a challenge. Cliff Yarbrough, for example, has been facing a reality of uncertain housing for much of this year. Widespread discrimination from landlords and public housing authorities based on an individual's criminal record, coupled with the scarcity of affordable housing options, make it difficult to secure stable housing upon re-entry into society.
I was in the process of applying for housing, and the caseworker that I had said that they didn't put me in because of my charge. and they said they will put me in again. And I feel within, because of what I was charged with, that they are just dragging me right along, probably not putting me in when they say they are putting me in because of what I was accused of.
According to the Institute for Justice Research and Development at Florida State University, about 60% of formerly incarcerated people depend on family and friends for housing immediately upon release. However, for someone who's been incarcerated for decades, family members pass and friends move on, so this source of housing isn't as reliable as it is for people with shorter sentences. People with felony convictions from the District of Columbia are unique in that they never lose their voting rights. However, in this discussion about the effects of a felony conviction after release from prison, it's important to note that this is not the case for the vast majority of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. In all states but two, people who are convicted of a felony lose their right to vote when they enter prison. In 23 states, voting rights are automatically restored after release. But in 25 states, formerly imprisoned people can be banned from voting for several years after being released. In some states, people with felony convictions can lose their right to vote for the rest of their lives. Here's Blair Bowie, the director of Restore Your Vote at the Campaign Legal Center.
Across the U.S., over 4 million Americans with past felony convictions are legally denied their right to vote because of felony disenfranchisement laws in their state. There are an estimated over 24 million Americans who have past felony convictions, and over 80% of those people actually do have the right to vote, but a lot of them don't exercise it and actually believe that they don't have the right to vote because these laws can be really confusing and they vary widely from state to state.
Furthermore, formerly incarcerated people face an uphill battle in their pursuit to become gainfully employed. According to data published by the Justice Department, roughly 60% of federal prisoners are jobless a year after being released. While Timothy, Charles, Cliff, Levi, Russell, and Chris are all currently employed, their options for sustainable compensation are extremely limited. They're also unable to pursue careers in fields they're passionate about. Timothy Catlett, for example, spent 30 years working in prison kitchens and found a real calling in culinary arts. He hoped to pursue this field further after his release.
I went on quite a few interviews with restaurants, and when I go on the interviews, it was mostly, have you worked in a restaurant for a year? Have you worked in a restaurant for 2 years? And if not, then, they wasn't hiring you.
None of the employers Mr. Catlett approached considered his decades of work in prison kitchens legitimate enough to fulfill their 1 to 2 year experience requirement. While in prison, Mr. Catlett went out of his way to pursue training to prepare him to work in restaurants upon release. But these efforts also didn't seem to make a difference for prospective employers.
I got my manager's license. I got my overall food service cost license. I mean, what more could you want? What made it so frustrating is that they hire a lot of people that I know that don't have the experience that I have.
Like Mr. Catlett, Charles Turner developed skills and found a passion in his work.
One job I liked when I was in the procurement field, and I used to decipher government contracts. I've seen some really big government contracts for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Big ones, 20 million, 50 million. And I had to read the contract and make sure that the wording was correct and all the specs was correct. I had to read pages and pages.
After his release, Charles has been unable to secure a job as a procurement specialist. He's currently employed at a library as a custodial worker. Like Charles, several of these men have career aspirations they cannot pursue due to their status. For example, Cliff Yarborough currently works for a program called Safe Passage, which ensures DC students safe entry and exit from schools. He has a real passion for working with kids and would be an excellent teacher or school aide, but he can't legally work for DC public schools until his name is cleared. The widespread trauma these men suffered while locked inside prison walls has stuck with them long after re-entering society. Timothy Catlett told me,
I have a dream every now and then about being inside, yes. Yeah, I just had one the other night. Your mind play games with you if you just let it. It will play games with you.
After being in a state of constant survival mode for decades while incarcerated, these men are constantly concerned for their safety. For Levi Rouse, he notices this particularly when he goes out to eat.
When I go in a restaurant, I always get up and check all the doors, which way to get out, which way to get in.
Russell Overton feels a similar sense of hypervigilance, even while at home.
The slightest little noise I hear, I'll go through the house, you know. It's not that I'm afraid. It's just I don't want no harm to come to me or my family.
After facing such poor treatment by police officers, these men live in a constant state of vigilance around law enforcement. Here's Chris Turner again.
You find yourself always looking in your mirror, rearview mirror, once you go past a police. Now, are they looking for a reason to stop me? And so you don't get to live a normal life. There isn't a normal day of driving to work, driving home from work anymore, because that psychologically always plays a part in your mind.
There's also a level of agony some of them hold in their hearts for their inability to see loved ones before they passed. Here's Charles Turner again.
I was treated like crap when I was in. I couldn't see my father. I wanted to see my own father before he passed. I couldn't see my grandmother. Couldn't see my mother. And so it became a source of bitterness for me.
Despite attending therapy and being part of support groups, there are certain aspects of the trauma these men have experienced that will probably never leave them. Emotional scars that will never heal. Here's Russell Overton again.
Anybody that's been locked up so long, 3 decades, you know, and you come back to society, you're trying to fit in, you know, be happy. But how can you be happy whenever you got something so terrible over your head? I mean, it's a mental thing. Well, why this happened to me? I mean, that was cruel. I ain't holding no ill feelings against no one or anything. I just wish this be over with and the truth be out.
Levi, Charles, Cliff, Chris, Timothy, and Russell will of course never be able to get back the decades of their lives that were taken from them. However, a presidential pardon would be an effective step in aiding their journey to healing. As we await a potential pardon, we will continue to publish updates in real time on the Alley feed, so stay tuned. If you're called to act, you can sign a letter of support at 8thNHjustice.org. You can also help by talking about this case on social media using the hashtag 8thNHjustice. That's the number 8, THANDHJUSTICE. I'll put all of this information in the show notes.
The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. Ida B. Wells.
Thank you for listening to The Alley. This has been a New America Studios production. Our host and executive producer is Shannon Lynch. Our co-producers are David Lanham, Joe Wilkes, and me, Carly Anderson. Social media by Maika Malit. Visuals by Alex Brignes. Media outreach by Heidi Lewis. Additional assistance from Ben Sands and Morel Mackey. Please rate, review, and subscribe to The Alley wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Stay tuned for our next 6 episodes, which will allow listeners to get a deeper understanding of who the men from the 8th and H case are as individuals.